Good morning, everyone. My name is Luis Villa, and we have Roberto as, sorry, I'm letting people in at the same time.
Go ahead, Luis. I'll let people in.
Okay. And we'll be hosting and be facilitators for this symposium. Just a few things to note. Everybody is muted. If you do have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. We'll be looking at the chat as well. So if you have a question, go ahead and send a message there. Well, a few things to note is that today we have Dr. Susan Chandler with us and Ismael Santillanes.
Santillanes.
Santillanes, sorry about that.
That's all right.
I'm getting at the same time, I'm trying to read your name on it. And just a few things to note is that Dr. Chandler is an associate professor at Emirates in the School of Social Work and the University of Nevada in Reno, where she includes her teachings in mass incarceration, race, and injustice. Ismael Santillanes is co-presenting with Dr. Chandler. He is currently a student at Antioch. How do you say that? I'm sorry.
Antioch
University of Los Angeles. And that's about all I have. I mean, I do have some more stuff. I'm sorry if I just briefed, introduce you guys, but you're more than welcome to go ahead and start. Dr. Chandler.
Good. Thank you, Luis. My name is Ismael Santillanes. Everyone calls me Izzy. It's a lot easier to pronounce. I should have told Luis that before he stumbled upon my last name. But if you say Izzy, I will respond. We're talking about prison and education and formerly incarcerated people and education. As a I was about to say formerly incarcerated students, but not necessarily students in there or not necessarily students out, but the importance of it and the combination of an education while in prison and while we were out now. I spent well over 28 years incarcerated in the Nevada system. And my education was through poetry. I had 23 years studying poetry under Sean Griffin, a very compassionate man who taught me poetry. And it was through that poetry that I actually am able to sit here now and talk to you about how important an education is. But I'll get into that when it's my turn. For now, we're going to allow Susan Chandler to do her part first. So Susan.
Okay. Thank you, Izzy. I should say that we are really honored to be with you today. And I have to begin by acknowledging the remarkable progress that California systems of higher education, and especially the community colleges, have made over the last 6 years in providing classes and services to incarcerated and former incarcerated students. And so while Danny Murillo would remind us, especially through the possibility report, that there is much, much more to be done, to me, coming from Nevada, this looks like heaven. So thank you. I have to say thank you especially to Cassandra Little. Cassandra and I go way back, 28 years, I think I calculated, and she is just an incredible person. You're very lucky to have her. We're unlucky to have lost her. And thank you also to all the incarcerated and formerly formerly incarcerated men and women who write and speak so courageously. So I have a couple of jobs this morning. One is to talk about education in prison. The second is to make sure I end my remarks by 11 or a little after, so that you will have a full chance to hear Ismael Santillanes, who will take you into worlds that I cannot. I'm going to give you the perspective of education in prison from the point of an instructor, Izzy from the perspective of a student. So as Luis said, I have taught at the University of Nevada, Reno in the School of Social Work for 25 years. And when I retired in 2013 from full-time teaching, I began teaching in a Nevada medium security men's prison. So the issue of mass incarceration, it's safe to say, has been at the center of my life for many years. I talk and write about it. I testify in the state legislature. I argue with colleagues at the university, questions of policy. And I work as part of the Nevada Prison Education Project, NPEP, which is trying to do some of the very things that you have already accomplished in California. So I'm going to talk about prison teaching, but I want to begin with a story from the university. So I have taught a university senior level social work class titled Mass Incarceration, Race and Justice for the last several years. And at the beginning of the course, I always ask students, how close is this subject, mass incarceration, to you? So please imagine how you would answer that question right now. We can't go around and hear all the answers, but in your mind, think about what you would say. I was blown away the first time. Fully 20 of the 50 students had a personal connection with someone imprisoned. And these are quotes from them. It's my mom who has mental illness, my dad, my cousin who was detained for 2 years, then deported, my fiance, my uncle who is a Black Panther, and myself. These students had significant knowledge and experience, but no one knew it though, because the stigma on college campuses, including in a social work classroom, is enormous. But once the classroom space is opened, a large silent population emerges. Their knowledge and compassion transformed the classroom, absolutely. This year on Zoom, the mass incarceration class again was full of stories. 4 students out of 30 had themselves been incarcerated, including one, a long haul trucker, my favorite student, who joined us every week from the cab of his truck. In particular, Latinx students said over and over again in response to that question, it's very close. My mother was detained. My cousins are undocumented. I am undocumented. Over the course of the semester in papers and sometimes in class, those stories poured out alongside students' commitment to be a social worker so I can help families like my own. As an educator, I can't say how important that commitment is. So why tell that story? To honor my students, of course, but because also we sometimes imagine that prison and mass incarceration is off there down the highway behind walls. But no, it's right here on our campus in our classrooms. Some of us don't realize it. Others know it intimately because they grew up in the communities who are daily impacted by mass incarceration. I should add that I just recently, sorry, somebody came to my door. I just recently gave a short class to a group of senior citizens who were all white. And when I posed that question to them, none of them had any direct contact with mass incarceration. So the Rising Scholars Initiative is definitely about formerly incarcerated students, but let's think even more broadly. It's also an affirmation to students who themselves have not been incarcerated, but whose lives are utterly impacted by mass incarceration. So now I'm going to turn to classrooms in prison. So for the past 6 years, I've been teaching classes in creative writing, history, and literature at a Nevada state prison. These classes were not credit bearing. They led to no degrees. I was there as a volunteer, and the men received no recognition or good time credit for showing up. Nevertheless, those classes stand for me without a doubt at the top of 25 years of university teaching. Now, there is one critical idea that guides me in the prison classes, and it comes chiefly from Father Greg Boyle of Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles. Now, I hope that several of you are familiar with Homeboy, which is the largest gang intervention program in the world, and whose motto is jobs, not jail. I actually, I don't know if you can see this, but I'm wearing a jacket, a Homeboy jacket today, and it has that motto, jobs, not jails. So if you're called to working in this area, you really, really must become familiar with Homeboy Industries. And the best way to do that is by, the easiest way to do it, I should say, is by reading Father Greg's books, Tattoos on the Heart. I use this book all the time in my classes and in my prison classes also. Father Greg talks about radical kinship, the idea that nothing separates us. It's not a question of me, the professor up there, and the student down here, or the administrator up there, and somebody who is going to benefit from the program down here. No, it's kinship. It's kinship, the idea of humanity, not serving the other, but being one with the other. Or as Father Greg would say, not me, us. So just to describe the setting. So imagine the prison all around with the barbed wire and the guards and the guns and the locks, and where everything in it is designed not to rehabilitate, but rather to break you. And in addition, where the attitude is that people in the prison are not worthy of education and perhaps not capable of education. And I should say those things are communicated so often, not just personally, but by policies and by the architecture and everything. So you have this situation of this tremendous power, like this on the one hand, and this little seed on the other. Forgive my hands for shaking. I'm not actually nervous. I have it's a condition. And we have this little seed on the other that which is a powerful assertion. That seed is that assertion of shared humanity in the face of all that denies it. So that is what gives prison classes their power. It's a really big thing. It's that little idea of humanity coming up against everything that denies it. So let's say it's 7:30 on a winter morning, and I go in, and there are several class members waiting to greet me at the gate, broad smiles all around. Nevada is a mass incarceration state. African Americans, for example, make up 9% of the general population and 29% of the prison population. And the classes more or less reflect that. I taught for several years in Unit 1, the Senior Structured Living Program. It's for men over 55, and my connections there were often with older men, many lifers, people that had been in prison for a long time. I did not teach from a syllabus. It was not a question of a semester-long class. I just resolved I was there every week, and I resolved to bring in the best material I could possibly find for us. And so I'd come with as many books and material like papers and pencils as I thought I could get through the gatehouse without being stopped. So Luis, this is at this point, if you could put that picture of the class, these are a few members of the class and me up you can just keep it up for a minute or so. So now I'm going to tell 3 stories in which you'll get to know some of the men that were in the classes. And if I can tell those stories sufficiently well, you might gain a sense of what radical kinship is about.
Dr. Chandler, I actually haven't gotten your email yet.
Oh, you haven't? Okay, well, we'll just skip the picture then. It's not that important. So the first story is really just a sketch, and it's very short. So Ernest, these are not real names, is an African-American man in his 70s, serving a ridiculously long sentence. Ernest knew African-American history better than anyone in the prison. But he also possessed tremendous wisdom. I had a friend who told me, who also taught in prison and told me before I went in that anyone who survives a long prison term without losing his or her soul has done some very, very deep thinking. And I always found that to be true. So the reason why Ernest had that knowledge was partly his own experience. He was the son of Arkansas sharecroppers, but equally important in his life was his contact with the Nation of Islam early in his prison stay. So I say this because I think it's really important for educators like us to enter prison with considerable humility. We are not by a long shot the first to bring books and classes into prison. People have been doing that forever. And as Danny was saying, like the sharing of books in the SHU, the passing around of ideas, the discussion of things. So that little tiny sketch was a very short way of saying to honor what went before. So the second story is a little longer and is out of a creative writing class. And in this particular class, we were reading Emerson, the great 19th century transcendentalist, at the request of Joseph D., a class member. Now, Joseph is white, he's born again, he's a Marine veteran, he's tattooed, and at 73, he was serving a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. You may be surprised that Joseph reads Shakespeare and the Greek classics avidly and is a big fan of the Transcendentalist. So we're reading on Emerson's On Nature aloud, and the men, as always, are fully engaged. Mid-discussion, Ahmed M. breaks in with a comment that to him, transcendentalism sounds a lot like Sufism. So Ahmed is an African-American man in his early 60s who has been a practicing Sufi Muslim for nearly 40 years. He reads the Quran daily and can recite long passages in Arabic. Joseph is completely annoyed by Ahmed's remarks and waves him off and telling him that there is nothing of Sufism and transcendentalism. And we go on with the discussion. But I am intrigued, and at home I Google the subject and discovered that the relationship of transcendentalism and Sufism is a whole field with books and dissertations and scholarly articles in abundance. So I copied 2 of the articles, very scholarly, and take them into class with a request that Ahmed and Joseph lead a further discussion the following week. So the next week, the air is just electric in the classroom and everybody is grinning except Joseph, and who just does not like the idea that that there is a relationship between a Muslim mystic and transcendentalism, which of course is his whiteness and racism speaking. So, but for the rest of us, somehow we instinctively get the import of this completely unexpected connection between worlds. 13th century Persia, 19th century New England, and 21st century US mass incarceration. And it's all happening in our lousy prison classroom. It's an affirmation of the men's intellect and hearts, and an affirmation and an example of the kind of scholarship that can develop in a prison classroom. Scholarship and discussion that would not happen in any of my university classes. So very interesting. So incidentally, Joseph did not come back to the class for the next 2 weeks, and I thought I'd lost him. But then he came back, and now, so that's probably 3 or 4 years ago, he hangs into that class stronger than just about anyone. And he has changed in so many ways. Here's a quote that he wrote: "I'm going to die in prison, but I'm going to die a better man." So my last story, which is the longest, is in part about how a teacher's life can change. So Alex was a Lakota man, probably in his late 60s, from the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation, just down the Missouri from Standing Rock. Alex grew up on the reservation, way in the back, he would say, raised by his grandparents speaking Lakota. But life intervened, I'm not sure how, and Alex spent most of his growing up years in foster care, raised by a white family in a white town. It was a disaster for Alex, his sister told me much later. In Minneapolis, where he landed, alcohol and jail claimed ever bigger pieces of his life. In time, he moved west. I'm not sure what his crime was. The etiquette is not to ask. But by the time we met in 2014, he'd been in Nevada prisons for over 20 years. His applications for parole denied repeatedly. His is a story of great pain. But as Father Greg would say, there is always light. In prison, Alex had found a deep, deep sense of who he was. He became a master craftsman, a fine artist, a gifted poet, and a person other men, particularly other Native men, turned to for guidance. I think Alex and I were somehow waiting to meet each other. My very first day teaching at the prison, I began, like I begin all my university classes, with a round of introductions. And when the circle came back to me, I started at the very beginning with my growing up in Minnesota. Then, crazily, because I had just read this wonderful book and written a piece about it, I started telling the story of my Minnesota ancestors who'd homesteaded there in the 1870s, and how much as a child I'd loved visiting my relatives' farms. But the story takes a big turn. That land, I went on, was not empty when my great-grandfather acquired it. For centuries, it had been the homeland of the Lakota people. In 1851, they'd been forced to cede millions of acres to the US government in exchange for a small reservation and the promise of annuities. By 1862, the people were starving on the land that had long given them sustenance. And that year, an uprising broke out, crushed within 6 weeks. I wish I could talk for an hour about this history, but as a result of the uprising, 38 Lakota men were hung in Mankato, Minnesota, just down the road from my childhood home in 1862, in the largest mass execution in US history. I knew nothing, and I mean zero, of that history, though I grew up in Minnesota and as a child took Minnesota history twice. Not a word came through from my family or teachers. I learned of it first in 2013 from that book, not long before I started teaching at the prison. After the hanging, the Lakota people were banned forever from the state of Minnesota and sent to live on a South Dakota reservation. The county in which the reservation is located was listed in the 2010 census as the poorest county in the United States. As for my ancestors, it was the defeat and hangings that cleared the way 10 years later for them to settle in Minnesota. In 2004, upon my parents' death, I inherited one of the small homesteads. I sold it, and it is that money in part that I live on today. For whatever reason, I told that story in our first class at the prison. From his seat, Alex nodded and said, yes. Oh, Mankato. The history which was invisible, unknown to me, was well known to him. He came up at the end of class and shook my hand. We looked at each other, and that was the beginning of 6 years of connection. I brought him every book I could. He gave me much more, the insight and wisdom of his life. Because of Alex, I have gone twice to Pine Ridge, tracked down countless historical sites, read voraciously in the history, and live with the reality of my own and my family's complicity. I keep my heart and my checkbook wide open because of Alex. Our friendship changed my life. A year and a half ago, Alex died. He died in the night just before our weekly class meeting. The men came in and told me, and we sat around that table with tears running down all of our faces. So, Ernest, Joseph, Ahmed, Alex, I hope you get some sense of just the strength and sustaining power of human connection in prison classes. Prison classes literally save lives. They keep people connected, keep people going another week, another month, another year, keep minds and hearts alive. People find life rafts, one man said in class. Sometimes it's music, religion. For us, it's this class. You are also in a position to create life rafts. I bet I can guess with 90% accuracy that you encounter someone directly impacted by prison or incarceration every week, perhaps every day, though you may not realize it at first because I was incarcerated or my mother is incarcerated, generally is not the sentence people lead with. If you are staff or faculty, you may be the person who encourages your department to look at policies related to formerly incarcerated students. If you teach, you may be the single faculty who includes information about incarceration in your classes. If you are staff, you may be the person who says to a student, yes, I can help you. You can be that person who realizes the shared humanity, or as Father Greg says, the radical kinship. And it won't be only the student who benefits. You will too, more than you can imagine. So thank you. And I'm going to turn, thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Ismael Santillanes now.
Wow, huh? I am not many times can I say this with so much humility in my heart. I am honored to be on the same platform talking to you all as with Susan Chandler. She is a tremendous mind and a powerful heart, and I can only wish that I gain more and more knowledge from her that will assist me in my quest to also help others. Thank you, Susan. That was quite powerful. Somebody put it in the chat and it came up, and it is a very powerful thing. I am going to die in prison, but I am going to die a better man. Didn't even have to write that quote down. It's stuck with me. So just I'm blown away. I'm blown away. Okay, so I was incarcerated for well over 28 years. I used to say 29 years, but then I started calculating, and I always knew that it was less than 29, but it was almost. Anyways, that doesn't matter. What matters is what happened to me in prison. And what happened to me in prison was much earlier in another Zoom session. I was lucky to hear Danny Murillo's story from him. And it was quite a powerful thing to hear him talk about the transformation he's gone through and continues to go through, and all the ideals he has about education and how powerful it is in the transformation of lives, in and out of prison. So my transformation in prison came about through a poetry workshop. And I want to start off by reading a small portion of a poem. Maybe I should read the whole thing. I timed myself yesterday and it was about 20 minutes. So I'll just read the whole poem. It's not very long. It's by Kipling, and the poem is a very well-known poem in the poetic circles. It's called If. So here it is. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. If you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hating. and yet don't look too good nor walk too wise. If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same, if you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken and stoop and build them up with worn out tools. Excuse me, I'm trying to get over the Susan effect. There, I've named it. Now I can start the exercise. The rest of it is this: if you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose and start again at your beginnings and never breathe a word about your loss, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it. And, which is more, you'll be a man, my son. I was going to read only the first stanza of this poem, so sort of to kick me off into the conversation. But the whole poem talks about virtue, and that's what, you know, sort of makes these men, or these, or in Kipling's, he's addressing his son. These are the things that will make his son a man. And you think about why are we so adamant about telling people education is important? Eventually, we can, you know, we see in the world, on this planet, especially here in the United States through our media, that the importance of education for many is success, having a huge bank account. And what I have been thinking is that education isn't success in that sense. It is success for money's sake, but when I think about it, success in education for me is gaining these types of virtues. So last night, or the night before, I wrote an email to Susan, and we've been for a couple of days communicating about, hey, where's your head and where's my head, you know, and trying to get some idea of what we're going to talk about. And I wrote to her, and I'll just read the email, or part of it. I'm sure the understanding going in is how important an education is, whether or not an individual is in prison. But my task, talking about my task, is to shade the inside of the coloring book. And it's just a play on words, the inside being prison. The good thing is that I was able to forge through the chaos of my own mind and to sit quietly. In these events, dealing with what matters, I deal out my heart. It is good to have a dress rehearsal of sorts. In my case, writing things down I'd like to remember to say, in a way of keeping the love in my heart from going off like a bomb in all directions. And so I started with this piece from Kipling to do just that, to keep me focused on what I needed to say, and to give myself an in into this conversation. So the last part of the email to Susan, that this poem, I'm talking about the poem, I think it's sage advice for a prisoner. Of course, Kipling was addressing his son in the poem, but every man I met in prison was or is someone's son. Either way, I have found that many times all I need is a way into the conversation. After I'm in, the truth takes over. So I'm going to mention an analogy, or not mention an analogy, but sort of a description of what an analogy is, and how we measure things. A little story, just a very quick story about measurement, so that, well, let me just do that. Much of what we described in our respective lives has been drawn from comparisons. Now, who hasn't used that introduction to a simile? You know, it's like, and then you make your comparison. And why shouldn't we use similes? Comparisons are very effective carriers of ideas. They form, through language, ideas in a listener's mind as to what the describer is talking about. But to get to the point in which a listener is able to form a comparative ideal from the describer's language, the listener must already have in memory at least one other ideal, very well defined or defined enough to juxtapose in that comparison. If he has no idea already in his mind, what you're telling him is new and sometimes difficult to understand. Eventually, as listeners, we amass a catalog of ideals against which we measure an ideal that's being presented to us. Okay, we call that making an analogy, right? So here's a little story. When I was a kid, my grandfather and I used to sit beneath a huge fig tree at his place. He would sip, not always, but I remember for some reason that he would sip on cognac and I would be sipping on a soda. It was during one of those fig tree sessions that he explained that the greatest gift God gave the human brain was an ability to measure. With this gift, he told me, the humans could take better care of themselves, invent machines, build homes, and we could also measure more spiritual things like relationships and feelings. And I really can't argue, because to this point, it's taken us to the moon and pretty much beyond our solar system. We're able to measure countless amount of things in the galaxy and in the universe. And I wanted to mention that because it is the metaphor, the analogy, and that ability to measure that are the elements, the individual elements that work in poetry. And this next section that I have is actually a journal entry I had that I simply called "I Blame Sean." Now, Sean is Sean Griffin. He's my mentor in poetry, has been for well over 30 years. He's put up with me and I continue to put up with him. But he's the one who went in at first. It was a university, a UNR class, a 300 and 400 level class that he went in and taught about poetry. And after that, we couldn't get the people to sign up. So we ended up starting up a workshop and he volunteered. And he continues to volunteer. And the simple fact that he volunteered 5 years, 10 years, the last 23 years of my incarceration were in that workshop. And so, and he still continues. It just astounds me how compassionate people can be. So here's a journal entry called "I Blame Sean." For the first 5 years in prison, nothing more closely describes my life as this: I existed, nothing more. Then I met Gary, incarcerated by then for many years. One day, out for a walk around the prison yard, he pointed out someone whose eyes were lifeless. He pointed out the head tilt, the bugler-stained fingers, the endemic lifer's coffee mug, how he moved past others without being noticed. As far as Gary could determine, our subject was walking around without a soul. Then Gary predicted, quite honestly, if you don't change, you'll end up like that. There has been no stronger a catharsis for me to change. I was brought up Catholic, so when people talk about souls, I take it very personal and I listen. So soon I landed a job at a college as a college clerk. Within this college program, I met Sean Griffin, who volunteered his time to run a prison poetry workshop called Razor Wire. And so for the next 23 years, Sean became my mentor, my father, my brother, and my priest. Sean's first rule, what I call the Griffin imperative, is write only what you know. Now, while that might seem an elementary task for many, when I first sat to write only what I knew, I failed quite a few times. Seemed that of the many things I knew, nothing was worth writing about. That's my personal opinion. Then came a somewhat conceited idea that has driven every line I have written since. I know me. Talk about conceit. So I began to write poems that reflected what I understood then as personal perspectives. Meanwhile, Sean's steady hand guided and encouraged the path I had taken. Then I noticed something unexpected. The more I wrote, the more I found out how little I actually knew about myself. All my life, I thought I had been simply doing time. And it wasn't intended as a pun either, but I had been simply doing time, not worrying whether or not what I did or thought or said had any profound meaning. Even the psychological and emotionally falsely stoic position of simply existing those first 5 years of incarceration were selfish. I went there because I didn't want to deal with it. So here is where poetry saved my life. Like Joseph Campbell said, it's the journey. And so it was, and still is with poetry. The more I sat to write a line, the more I searched for that one concise and transcendent word. Poetry's succinct quality forced me to search deeper into what I truly wanted to express. That one act was each time a question into who I was. And so the more I wrote, the more I searched, and the more of me I found. It was during that journey of searching for the right word that I found my own sense of humanity. And so I approach education through the sense of self-actualization or self-search. When I talk about analogies, or somebody mentions analogies and I'm listening, or metaphor, or any of those powerful things that help poetry, the language of poetry, transcend, then what I'm looking at is when a person has more ideas in the catalog we call our brain, he is more easily able to understand other ideas. And when we're brought up in homes like Danny so powerfully described, filled with domestic violence, and we go to school and we're being bullied or just going through all these sociological warfares, you know, even as a child, it's just like tremendously difficult for people to go to school. Little kids going to school, you know, they're not going to learn, they're going there to see how they can survive that day without coming home crying, wiping their tears before they get home so that they can tell their mother everything's fine. So when I look at that, then I think about what can you do? What can we do as in education? What can I do as a poet? I'm in an MFA program now with Antioch University, trying to get a master's degree. There's a reason I want that master's degree, and it isn't so that I can put it on a wall. It's so that I can stuff it in my heart and I can go out there and tell people how poetry saved my life. But more than that, right now, what I'm trying to do is write a proposal, because I'm still on parole. Okay, I've been on parole for 8 years. I'm from Nevada, so came from Nevada into the California system as a transfer. And so in Nevada, when you have life, you do life parole. When you've been sentenced to life sentence, then you do life parole if you're lucky enough to get paroled. So what I'm trying to do right now is write a proposal to start up a workshop, hopefully working with parolees, or at least people at risk of losing themselves to the system in some way. And it's taken me a long time, because this proposal matters, because the people I need to propose it to are actually the parole system. And they need to okay this so that I can continue. Now, when I eventually open up this workshop, because if the parole department doesn't do it, I'm just going to keep going and finding a place that I can do it myself, or, you know, through assistance somewhere. Whatever it is I have to do, I need to get this done. So when I open up this workshop, I'm going to open it up so that people can read poetry, learn from people already published, and write. I need to teach human beings to write, and these human beings are going to write. But the one thing that I'm actually looking for is I want them to sit down with themselves. I want them to search who they are so that they can get to know themselves. Now, when I got out of prison, I went through a halfway house, and this halfway house is a 12-step program oriented halfway house. So one thing I noticed about 12-step programs is one of the ideals that stuck with me is that the person going through 12-step program must want to change. So how do you get around that? You know, how do you, that was the whole problem I had with this halfway house thing. How do you get around that? Because a lot of the people I met in that halfway house were there to do their 3 months. I certainly was, and then go get a place of my own. So how do you get around the ideal that you need to change this person, but that person must want to change? Well, don't try to change them. Have them write. Have them write a poem and teach them about poetry's succinctness. Teach them about poetry's conciseness. Teach them about how poetry, a metaphor, can transcend the page. Teach them all these things that I learned that actually made me look into myself. Like I said in my journal entry, that one act of searching for the right word was each time a question into who I was. And it is a question into who I was, and it continues to be that question. Who am I? Why am I so attached to this word as opposed to the other word? And so I think it's a good idea. I'm writing up this proposal, I'm trying to get it done so that I can propose it to the parole department so that they can okay it, so that I can find a place and bring together parolees or people at risk and teach them poetry, to teach them to sit with themselves, teach them to search in and ask themselves who they are. So that's the way I approach education. After they search for themselves, after they actualize themselves, self-actualize themselves to a degree, then, they have a better understanding of where they need to be. And hopefully it'll be in a classroom with Susan Chandler, in a classroom with Victoria Chang, in a classroom anywhere where you have these great minds and great hearts, teaching them how to better form their ideas so that they can also step out and continue the fight. That's where I'm coming from with education. I was saved through poetry. I am here because I was educated through poetry. Thank you for listening. And we still have some time. And Susan and I had talked about how we were going to sort of have a conversation between ourselves. I don't know what she was thinking when she said that, but I thought, okay, good idea. I've done it before with a radio show, and Sean and I, Susan, actually just had a conversation between ourselves about poetry and much about what I had just talked about. So I wanted to ask you a question. It was a question that I posed to Danny Murillo in the chat when he was talking. And the question is sort of this. Now, I come from the idea that if I search for the right word, this is just an idea. If I search for the right word, and I continue to search for that word and pose it against other words, then I'm actually asking myself, who are you? Okay, so that's just like a singular idea that sort of gets me going into these ideas of, making a program, writing my proposal, so that I can try to help out in my community. Is there an ideal that you have, and it doesn't have to be a didactic thing or an educational, textbook sort of ideal, but sort of an ideal that you sometimes want to secretly plant into someone's brain, your students' brains, so that they can take it and if it grows, they can do something good with it. Is there an ideal that you have that sort of is the seed that grows?
Wow. Well, I'll answer that. Before I should, and I bet Luis is ready to say this also. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I think Luis will read them to us. Yeah, and I have a question for you too, Izzy. You know, it was very interesting. I struggled, as you know, I struggled a lot, and it might be because of COVID. It might be because I haven't been in prison for 14 months now. That is a big, that's big loss. It's a big problem for prison education. And so I because of how you think, I was just struggling and thinking, I don't have anything to say, all that kind of stuff. And I thought then I thought after some of the angst had gone, it's a process of I couldn't find myself. I couldn't find myself. And just the talk with you and that idea that you have, you use words, sometimes I use history. I mean, history is in me in the way that words are in you, like where I came from, what was happening when I grew up, where you came from, what was happening when you grew up. That's how I know people, in the same way that words work for you. But yeah, I think that idea of, you know, you think trying to find yourself, well, what does that mean? It means, but we're so impacted by, you know, what's going on in, you know, a fairly ugly world around us, and that it takes a while it takes real work to find out who we are in the world, and it's work that it repeats every day. It repeats every day, every year of our life. It doesn't like it. It's not like one process you find it and then you're set. No, always you have to do it. And so, yeah, I really, the question I have for you, Izzy, is I was wondering if you could just take a few minutes and describe what it was like in that poetry workshop with Sean in the prison. I never, you know, we work in the same prison, and I always wanted kind of to be a part of that workshop, but of course, I mean, you know, a visitor to the workshop, but of course that doesn't happen. So I just am curious, what, like, you walk in the door and what happens?
Well, my experience with the workshop was that when the yard was somewhat open, and so we had access to the building where the workshop was held, and so in other words, it's not as restrictive. It wasn't as restrictive as it is now with this pandemic and the Zoom thing. But I also heard from Sean that before the pandemic, it was becoming more restrictive. They would allow, they broke the workshop into 2 workshops, or the same workshop is just two different days, so that 2 units one time and 2 units another time, something like that. However, when I was there, it was open. And we would walk in, Sean would give us a handout of poetry from another dead white poet, as he used to call them, Emerson, all these great poets, Elizabeth, Browning, all of them. And we would read the handout he gave to us the week before. So we would read the handout and we would comment on these published poets. After that, it would be our personal poetry, and we would read and comment on the poetry that we handed Sean the week before. He would bring in copies of all our poetry, and each one of us would get a copy of everyone else's stuff. So we would read it, and we became the critics at that point. And of course, Sean, being the compassionate man he is, had a rule for that. Only give positive feedback. If you're going to try to push somebody down, just don't say anything. So positive feedback. So we had to, a lot of times, because we were bumbling through language ourselves, we would struggle to find something positive to say. And it was a very difficult thing, because not only are we dealing with a lack of education in that area, we were also dealing with our own emotional chaos, our own emotional and psychological chaos within the prison setting. He would show up for an hour or two. We would be coming from our unit or from the yard, and he had no idea what our day had been like. He didn't know if there was a stabbing unless we told him. He didn't know whether or not we saw some young man get raped. He had no idea what was going on in the prison unless we told him when he showed up. And then, of course, he was there for a specific reason. So whatever bad stories or whatever good stories we had, he would have to say, okay, now let's get to task. And we would get to doing the poetry stuff. And it was interesting, because we had people who wrote poetry from all walks of life. We had a brilliant guy who, Doc, he eventually got out and went to Malta. Now, this man was very well educated. He was in pharmacology when he fell, and he was caught dealing whatever it was. It didn't matter what it was. Is that he was highly educated, very well spoken, spoke 3 languages, and wrote some very what I called very peaceful, but at the same time very powerful stuff. Now, we had that, and then we had other students who were struggling to put a sentence together, a basic sentence. And so, and we had everything in between. And then cultures, like you talk about the Emerson Sufi relationship or encounter. We had that. We had Muslims, Catholics, Jews, we had Jehovah's Witnesses, we had atheists, we had agnostics, we had them all in our workshop. And we would concentrate on whether or not the poem was effective. That's what brought us together. Is the poem effective? And we would concentrate on just that. It was a way of allowing different men to sit as one around a table. And so that to me was like going to church. It was to me a very spiritual moment, especially after the light went off one day and I realized that I was actually questioning who I was. And that ideal actually took about 10 years to come to me. And when it came to me, I thought it's about the most powerful thing I've thought about in poetry as far as my own personal development, my own personal transformation. So I've taken that and I use that. To me, that's the seed that I want to plant in other people, you know, and I don't have to tell them what I'm doing. I need to open up that workshop so that they can come and write. Just sit down and write. Search for that right word, you know, ask them the question, is that exactly what you wanted to say? So that's how the workshop was for me. You know, for others, it might have been differently, you know, it might have worked differently. We had of the men who got out of prison that were in the workshop, I think we had one guy come back in all the years that I was there. You know, so something, I believe, I might be wrong, but I believe that something worked in that workshop that made others the same, you know, only I'm able to express it. Maybe others are doing it somewhere else, but the same thing, that I found myself. I found my own sense of humanity through poetry. It saved me in that sense. So.
I wanted to say, Sean is my mentor too. You know, like when
He's like Santa Claus.
He
knows everybody.
Wonderful, yeah. And I have him speak to my class, and he always describes you and the people in the class as his friends. And I wait for that moment when he uses that word, because it breaks through so much idea about prison and barriers and that sort of thing. And I wanted people to know too, Izzy, if Sean were here, he would say it, that so Izzy is in this Antioch University's MFA program. He got into the program, actually, I think I'm saying this right, without a BA, on the basis of the quality of his, how do you say that word? Of his body of work, of poetry, writing. He's also a fine artist, and yeah.
I have no bachelor's degree. I have no bachelor's degree. They took me on the strength of my poetry and the essay that I wrote. It impressed Victoria so much that she decided, I'm going to call this reference, and she called Sean.
Yeah.
So I continue to blame Sean.
Right, yeah. Sean would say they called up and asked for the reference and asked how he, you know, how he knows Izzy. And he said, well, 23 years, where do you want me to start? Sitting across the table from him. Yeah. There was a question about resources, and I wrote that I'm glad to, I put my email address in, and I'm glad to send my syllabus to anybody that would like it. Yeah. Luis, are there other questions, or we're getting about to the end? Yeah.
No, you're getting a lot of praises. You did have the questions, but you actually answered him.
Okay, well, then, Izzy, I guess we can say thanks very, very, very much to everyone. It is It's an honor to be here. It is a great, how do you say it? We get so much from it, from an opportunity to speak like this. It is as important to us as maybe it might be to you. And thank you to everyone. Best of luck to you as you pursue this, the amazing Rising Scholars Program. And it's our hearts go out to you. We feel together.
Yes, thank you to the city, the Fresno City College for putting us on the symposium. It's so important and it's so powerful. And I'm sure that apart from the conversations that we've had already beginning this morning, especially with Danny Murillo, whose story was so powerful, that we will continue this afternoon and all tomorrow, listening to more powerful stories. And from that, I just want to go. I just want to get out there now and start yelling poetry to people. But thank you again to Fresno City College for putting this on for us. Thank you.
On behalf of myself, I'd like to thank you guys. I mean, a lot of that stuff was amazing. I didn't know how depth it was in the prison system, but I'd like to thank myself. If anyone else has some things they'd like to say, I think that was the time to say thank you. I mean, you're getting kudos a lot in the mail. I mean, in the chat. But like I said, I just wanted to say thank you guys.
Thanks, Luis. Thanks, Celia.
It was our pleasure to have you.